This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. Today, we have our fourth installment in our series, Journeying with God in Our Wilderness, where we are focusing on Sabbath. This focus will be built on Exodus 16, when the people of Israel receive manna in the wilderness, and they are told to just collect as much as you can have for one day, except for on the sixth day, collect enough for the next day, collect 2 days worth, because on that seventh day, you will hold a Sabbath. This is the first time in the Hebrew Bible that we have explicit instructions about a Sabbath. The Ten Commandments haven't happened yet. That'll happen in Exodus chapter 20. But here, when they receive manna, they are directed to hold a Sabbath. There have been a few things up to this point that are reminiscent of a Sabbath, most notably in Genesis chapter 1, that on the seventh day God rested, seemingly suggesting kind of a pattern. But this is the first time we have it. In this series, in the last 3 videos, we have been doing a lot of comparison of Egypt and wilderness. They are in the wilderness. They used to be in Egypt. They're always comparing. We have been doing that primarily through the concept of sacred space. And in fact, if you were to look through the history of Israel, you might see a chart that some would draw, such as myself, on whether or not the people were in the land, when they were in the land and when they were out of it. And if you look back on these video series that I in fact have a chart like this, that there's times when they're entering into the land, times when they're driven out. Here we are in the wilderness wandering. They're kind of wandering around, getting to Mount Sinai, and eventually heading back into the land. Probably culminated in when if this is Sinai, then this is Zion, and now they're in the land, the covenant with David, and that eventually you have a split history, so you get 2 kingdoms, but them eventually leaving the land, and then sort of being allowed back in, and so this would be in 729, this would be in 586 when they're driven out into exile. And then in 539, you have them allowed kind of back in, even though most people don't go. You see these kinds of depictions, and it's all based on space. Where are they? And we've had a lot of focus. Well, Sabbath is about something else. It's not about the space. Are they in the land? Are they not in the land? Instead, it's about this dynamic. It is a measure of time. It changes the character of where they are, because the focus is not really about the space, but about time that they are in. Sabbath really is a marker of time like nothing else is in the Hebrew Bible. So they're going to continue to focus on where are we now? Where are we? Who are we? Questions we ask in the wilderness. Who are we after all? But now the comparison is not only going to be about space, but now about time. Because, after all, one of the characteristics we have been reiterating about Egypt in their mind was enslavement. And when you are enslaved, there is no real time. We might call it there is daily work. But what we mean by daily is not so much that we're measuring out each day of the month and doing things, but as a constant work. You almost lose the concept of time if every day is simply the same. And in the ancient world, by the way, most societies did not have the modern invention of the weekends. Most people worked every day. And when you're enslaved, you certainly worked every day. There was no Sabbath. And if there was no Sabbath, then how you construct time is very different. Sometimes they would construct time around festivals. And we know that from other sources that this was a common way that, for example, in the Roman world, it would be this event was so many days after the first of the month, because the first of the month was a festival, or before the Ides, that is the 15th of the month, because that was a festival, or a particular festival. Sometimes that was a way of measuring time. But now with the introduction of Sabbath, now we have a different way of simply spending time. We have the introduction of a week because time matters. And so there is space in time for reflection. Here, there's no space for reflection because there's no time structured for reflection. We often associate Sabbath primarily with rest. It will absolutely be part of rest, but here in Exodus 16, I would submit it's less about the rest component and more about the measuring time. Who are we? Where are we? Can we reflect on who we are? And there's a phrase that almost always comes up with Sabbath, and it does here in Exodus 16. Holiness. Can you keep this Sabbath holy? Can you make this time set apart, dedicated to God? And of course, they do that not just so that it's this one day that's going to be holy, but so that all the days can be holy. Every time you measure time, you recognize time, this thing moving forward, the history of who we are, is something given to us by God because, and what does that lead to? Who are we but people God has chosen? And so there's the activities it talks about on Sabbath, or the lack of activities. No work, you don't collect manna, but you do that in keeping it holy. And in doing so, Sabbath becomes a place for worship, where the people reflect how God has served them and how they serve God. It's really both things at once. It's the expressed best, I think, of the German word, Gottesdienst, the service of God. It doesn't translate well into English. We serve God, God serves us, all in one move in worship. But notice what they mentioned. What is that worship? Well, it has a lot to do with, because the focus is on manna, where is our food coming from? The dinner table becomes a place for worship. And so we recognize not just who are we in the wilderness, but also who is God? Well, on the Sabbath, we take the time to reflect. We learn the lesson of the wilderness that God is giving to the people. There's a variety of other aspects going on with Sabbath as well, but this is the aspect I'd like us to consider as we move forward in this exploration of what is our wilderness that we have. How do we reflect and take the time to reflect on who God is in our own spaces for worship. So we see that we are indeed a holy people, not just that one day of the week, but all the days. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.